Hello and welcome to this latest instalment of A History of Role-Playing Games in 101 Objects. This video is going to be another one of those little sidebars. We did the unfortunate case of James Dallas Egbert III last time. This time we're going to look at what we call Appendix N. Appendix N of what, you might ask? Well, it's Appendix N of the first edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide. Gary Gygax, the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide, put a section, and you can see it reproduced here, of the books that were particularly influential on him when he was creating Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. There's no suggestion that it was the books that were particularly influential on Dave Arneson as well when he was co-creating Dungeons and Dragons, but Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is a Gygax labelled item only, no Arneson, as we've seen before. So Gygax gets to say what was influential on him. And looking at it, although there are exceptions that prove the rule, there are some common themes to the sort of fiction that it clearly influenced Gygax. You have to think, though, that he would have been producing what became Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in the mid-70s, and fantasy literature at the time is not necessarily in its infancy, but it's certainly not the huge genre behemoth that it is today. You would not go into a bookshop and see shelf upon shelf of big, thick fantasy trilogies. And so, in terms of what influenced Gygax, his selections are, to us as a modern reader, maybe seem a little strange, but possibly they were influenced by just simply what was available at the time. So what is a typical Appendix N book? I think it's worth, first of all, looking at sort of what I think of as the biggest exception in this list, and it's J.R.R. Tolkien's work. Appendix N was probably written before the Silmarillion was published. Silmarillion comes out in the late 70s, and I think probably Gygax had finished writing it down by that point. So it's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So it's Hobbit here. Incidentally, all the books I'm going to show you we've got in stock in the shop at the moment, so you can go and buy them. And some of them are quite hard to get hold of, which is why we made an effort a while back to try and secure some and have our own proper Appendix N department at the shop on the Borderlands. So here's a fairly early edition of The Hobbit, artwork by the professor himself. I really like this picture. This is a... this is not a 1974 printing of the 1966 edition. So it's not very, very early. It's obviously a 1930s book. But a nice paperback edition. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings especially, are epic high fantasy. People go on quests to save the world from the big bad guy. Most of the Appendix N works are not like that at all. And they're what we would nowadays call, I think, swords and sorcery. They're, individual characters who fight monsters, who get treasure, essentially to enrich themselves or to save a loved one. Not generally epic quests to save the world. I think that's probably the biggest difference between Appendix N and epic high fantasy. Because most of what we see now on bookshelves probably is epic high fantasy. Or even if it's not high fantasy, it's at least epic. It concerns great events. So Game of Thrones is not high fantasy, for example, but it is epic. It's on a grand scale. Most of the Appendix N works are, about one or two characters, and they don't really interact with that many other people. Certainly not on a great world-spanning stage. So again, that's probably the second difference. So we'll put The Hobbit. I don't have the Lord of the Rings to hand. We don't have one in stock at the moment. We've got like several copies in our personal collections, but nothing in the shop. The definitive work that looks at Appendix N with a critical eye, and this really is a superb piece of work. I can't recommend this book highly enough. It's Appendix N, The Literary History of Dungeons and Dragons by Jeffro Johnson. We have one copy of this in the shop. It's quite hard to get hold of. Cannot recommend this highly. Brilliant book. Jeffro Johnson looks at each book, reviews it both in its own right but also with a mind as to why Gygax picked it, how it's influential in Dungeons and Dragons. I'd even go so far as to say that, for the first time, I read this before I'd read a lot of the books, and it'll turn you off from reading some of them, and make you want to read some of the others. But again, absolutely brilliant piece of work. Well done, Jeffro Johnson. There's a link to his blog down below. I think he's a very clever guy. Jeffro Johnson, well done. So let's look at some of the key Appendix N books. I'll do my favourite first, actually, because this one is probably the most influential on Dungeons and Dragons that stayed influential. Jack Vance, Tales of the Dying Earth. This is an omnibus edition of 4 books, only the first 2 of which had been published by the time Appendix N was written. That's The Dying Earth and The Eyes of the Overworld. This also includes the 3rd books, Kugel Saga and Rialto the Marvellous. If you think D&D has 4 core character classes, ultimately: fighters, magic users, clerics, thieves. Okay, forget about fighters, forget about clerics. Magic users and thieves are from this work. Why magic users? Well, the idea that you cast specific spells, and once you cast them, you've forgotten them and have to learn them again. That, what we call Vancian magic, that is from the Dying Earth. And I think probably a lot of people realise that. Also, the idea that spells have specific names, often quite lengthy names, like Mordenkainen's Faithful Hound. The spells in the Dying Earth often have the name of the magician that first created them. But also, the thief character class comes from the Dying Earth. You might have thought, well, is it Bilbo in The Hobbit? No. Gygax is on record, in fact, as saying that the thief character class is based on Kugel the Clever in The Eyes of the Overworld. So there you go. That's 50% of the core classes from D&D. I just love Vance's use of language. I think they're great books. They're very, very D&D-ish if you play D&D in a certain way and your world is feels a bit whimsical. Few authors, or probably no authors, can match Vance's gift for lyrical wordplay. I think he's wonderful. He's absolutely one of my favourite authors. Actually, one of the best things we've got in stock at the moment. There is a Dying Earth role-playing game. We're very, very privileged to have in stock at the moment a copy of the Dying Earth role-playing game that was actually signed by Jack Vance himself, which is obviously very, very rare and priced accordingly. But very, very nice object. So there's the Dying Earth. I hugely recommend Dying Earth. Actually, there's a bit of a subgenre of novels, and this is another one in Appendix N that represents that subgenre. This is Fed Saberhagen's Changeling Earth, and it's the idea that in the far, far future, we'll go beyond science fiction and come back to fantasy again. So I think what it says on the back here, this planet was Earth. The time was 50,000 years from now. Magic and witchcraft worked, and the old science didn't. Classic sort of, it's a subgenre, if you like. A lot of the works in Appendix N are what we might think of as, I think they're often called heroic fantasy, but often the kind of thing where you've got a tough fighter, maybe with a clever sidekick. There's often a clever, quick sidekick. Getting into scrapes, killing monsters, killing evil sorcerers. Sorcerers are evil, always evil in these kind of works, and often not wearing very much. So that's what the classic one there is. Obviously, Robert E. Howard's Conan stories. There's only some of them. Actually, I think, a lot of people, if you've not read the Conan stories, if your experience of Conan is probably having seen the Schwarzenegger films or maybe the Jason Momoa thing, you might get the wrong idea about Conan. Actually, book Conan is rather more quick-witted than sort of Austrian monosyllabic Schwarzenegger in the films. don't get me wrong, I think the Schwarzenegger films in particular are good fantasy films, but the book Conan is very good. I can clearly see how Gygax was inspired by book Conan. Robert E. Howard, he was writing as long ago as the 20s and 30s. He predates Tolkien, really. his writing style is very good at writing action sequences, and I think probably I saw a discussion online the other day actually that was asking, what books do you recommend for a new dungeon master? And a lot of people coming in with sort of factual how to be a dungeon master kind of books. But somebody said, read the Conan books, because they tell you how to describe combat and make it exciting. And I think that's a very, very good point. So, recommendation, read the Conan books. There's lots of Conan stories that were written by people other than Robert E. Howard, particularly after his death. As far as I've never found any that were as good as the Robert E. Howard originals. So that's where I'd start. Start with the Conan stories written by Robert E. Howard. He's a really good author. There's lots and lots of Appendix N books are what we might consider to be Conan tributes, knockoffs. So here's a good collection. Swords Against Darkness is a collection of short stories by actually some pretty decent authors. But heroic fantasy in the tradition of Robert E. Howard. There's a whole series of these. Some of them are quite hard to get hold of, mentioned in Appendix N. Manly Wade Wellman's Hock the Mighty. Battle in the Dawn, the complete Hock the Mighty. I think fair to say a bit of a inspired by Conan, at any rate. And I suppose another one, Gardner F. Fox's Kothar, Barbarian Swordsman. Here's a hint, by the way. If you're in fur underpants, if you've got fur underpants on the cover, that's probably an indication that you're in an Appendix N kind of book, not a epic high fantasy Lord of the Rings kind of book. There's not as many fur underpants in Lord of the Rings as there are in Appendix N books. The exception to that, incidentally, is if you've ever seen Frank Frazetta's artwork for Lord of the Rings, in which everybody wears, well, really not very much from the waist down, to be honest. Particularly the orcs, but including Eowyn. Look them up. I can't describe them. Another major author that was a particular favourite of Gary Gygax, and TSR went and got the license. Fritz Lieber and his Lankmar books. They've appeared in lots of role-playing games over the years. At the moment, Goodman Games has the license and produces some very good Lankmar modules with their Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG. But TSR had the license, and there were lots of Lankmar adventures for a time for D&D. Later on, there was Lankmar for RuneQuest when Mongoose had the RuneQuest game. I think that's the first collection of Lankmar stories starring Farford. Never know how to pronounce that. Farford and the Grey Mouser. So again, you've got this strapping barbarian type and quick-witted, thiefy kind of companion. There's lots more. Lynn Carter did a lot of these books. That's typical. The Quest of Kaji, Beyond the Gate of Dream. Often these Appendix N books are fairly thin paperbacks, fairly pulpy paperbacks. Let's see, who else have we got? Roger Zelazny, probably more famous for Amber, but his book Jack of Shadows makes it into Appendix N. He awoke, if it could be called waking, in the dung pits of Glyve. Don't you want to get your characters to explore the dung pits of Glyve? I know I do. And a couple of authors that come up quite a lot, actually. Sometimes writing together, sometimes not. L. Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt. So they did the Mathematics and Magic series, which was something I've read and not particularly liked. They're quite influential. The Carnelian Cube is quite old school Dungeons and Dragons-y. I think that's probably quite influential. A lot of these have a sort of modern man going back to a fantasy setting and using his modern man intelligence and ingenuity to solve fantasy setting problems, and always winning the girl kind of thing in the end, and the girl is usually scantily clad. So here we have the guy is in this one is Arthur Cleveland Finch. Arthur Cleveland Finch was an eminently practical man. Naturally, he didn't believe that the Carnelian Cube was a dreamstone with supernatural powers. But of course, if he were going to wish himself into another world, he would choose one where everything was perfectly rational. ... This is Sprague de Camp on his own. Lest Darkness Fall. Again, we've got man of present day goes back in time. He's an archaeologist Martin Padway. 1 minute he's casually ambling through modern Rome. In an instant he is inexplicably hurtled back through time to 6th century Italy, just before the Dark Ages. Rather obviously fantasy, another de Camp, the Fallible Fiend. And I apologise for this truly terrible cover on this really naff, cheap edition of Fletcher Pratt's The Blue Star. Probably worth just reading out some of the big. Lillette Asterhax could not escape her destiny. She was a hereditary witch in a world where witchcraft was banned by ecclesiastical and temporary powers, and any man who possessed her would then gain possession of her precious blue star and all the powers it could bestow. There are famous authors in Appendix N. Andre Norton did a lot of good stuff. Andre Norton's interesting, I think, because if you picked a list of books that were influential for Dungeons and Dragons and a list of books that were influential for Traveller, science fiction role-playing game, you'd find Andre Norton on both of them, because she wrote particularly good fantasy and particularly good science fiction. She's also of interest because she wrote the very first literally Dungeons and Dragons novel based on Dungeons and Dragons, because she actually played in Gygax's Greyhawk campaign a couple of times, and she wrote up a bit of that as Quag Keep, which I have to say is a terrible novel. It's really poor. I didn't like it at all, but well, as a historian, it's probably worth checking out. That's one of our more typical fantasies. Incidentally, Jack Vance, I think, would also be an author that would appear in as influence for D&D and Traveller, and somebody else that we'll come to shortly, Powell Anderson. Philip Jose Farmer, you see his stuff. He's in Appendix N. This was a slightly odd, again, a future set fantasy, but it's probably influential in as much as it's got a multi-level dungeon in this, where the deeper you go down, the weirder and scarier it gets. You know, that's sort of like a traditional dungeon. Jeffro Johnson certainly makes the argument that this is probably where Gygax and or Arneson got the idea to have dungeons structured like that, where the scariest stuff is at the bottom. Sterling Lanier's Hero's Journey. Again, this is a future fantasy in the Holocaust world of ruined cities. I suppose a lot of these are written at the time during the Cold War, where you've got this fear of Holocaust. I suppose Planet of the Apes fits into this genre as well, doesn't it? So I'll probably spoil the end if you've never seen Planet of the Apes. Everybody's seen Planet of the Apes. In the Holocaust world of ruined cities, strange beasts and savage men, pair hero Destine, priest, telepath, and trained killer sets out on a dubious mission. A search to discover the lost secret of the ancients, in time to save humanity from destruction. His one weapon, the human mind. There's one author that Gygax seems to be a particular fan of, who I think is largely completely forgotten now, and that's Abraham Merritt. And a couple of his here, Dwellers in the Mirage is rather more obviously fantasy. Creep Shadow is arguably horror. I think it's worth reading out to you to give you some idea of what kind of author Abraham Merritt was. The blurb on the back of this edition. Merritt's stories typically revolve around conventional pulp magazine themes. A lot of the Appendix N authors are very pulpy. Lost civilizations, hideous monsters, etc. His heroes are gallant Irishmen or Scandinavians, his villains treacherous Germans or Russians, and his heroines often virginal, mysterious, and scantily clad. What more can you ask for? Somebody who I think probably isn't forgotten, and I think still counts as a major author, although I never thought probably got quite the attention he deserved. In the time when, you know, the three great science fiction authors are supposedly Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, and Robert E. Heinlein, I always think that Powell Anderson should have stood up there. So here's a couple of Powell Andersons. The High Crusade is aliens coming to medieval Europe, and if you've ever played the D&D adventure Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, which is a sort of aliens come to Greyhawk, I think I suspect there's an influence there. Good novel. This, on the other hand, is a superb novel, and I think one of the classics of the fantasy genre, The Broken Sword. If you want to do scary fairies, scary elves, in the sense sort of rather more evil changeling kind of elves than highfalutin Tolkien elves, do look at this. It's fantasy with an English Scandinavian setting, set in sort of during the days of Viking England. Had the misfortune to come out around about the same time as Lord of the Rings did, and it seems to have got a little bit overlooked. Michael Moorcock, who is another major Appendix N author, is a huge fan of this book, and I think it deserves a wider audience. So we've got a copy in stock, you've got no excuse. The Broken Sword by Powell Anderson, one of the best books you can buy. Another one by Powell Anderson, which we don't have in stock at the moment, but which is certainly worth getting for D&D players, particularly if you play Paladins, is The High Crusade. Sorry, not High Crusade, that was that. Is Three Hearts and Three Lions. Three Hearts and Three Lions, again, one of these stories where a modern day, or actually Second World War person goes back in time to a sort of fantasy setting. It's brilliant, and the person who goes back in time becomes sort of Ogier the Dane, who was historically, legendarily, one of Charlemagne's paladins. Gygax has said that this was the key influence on the development of the paladin character class. And if you want, it's the way to play a lawful good paladin. You know, if your players are, can't get past the idea of lawful stupid paladins, which is a trope I see far too much, then read that book. Now here's a particular subgenre which is well represented in Appendix N, and that's what we call planetary romance. It's the kind of stuff. Well, it's typically it's Edgar Rice Burroughs. So it's stuff like Princess of Mars, which is the Mars, Barzoom, John Carter stuff. And so not just Mars, there was also Venus, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Pirates of Venus. There were lots of scantily clad women in these. About scantily clad men. Nobody wears clothes in Edgar Rice Burroughs, in fact. And in fact, Inside the Earth, Edgar Rice Burroughs at the Earth's Core. All of these are in Appendix N. There are some weird ones. There's some that you strike you, well, this is science fiction. And yeah, I suppose arguably the John Carter of Mars kind of thing is sort of science fiction. It's on a different planet. I'm not entirely certain what the D&D influences are from G. Stanley Weinbaum, but he's in Appendix N. And this rather with a very strange short story collection by Frederick Brown. I've not read these, know very little about Frederick Brown, but again in Appendix N. There's horror in Appendix N. You might expect there to be H.P. Lovecraft, and you'd be right. So there's the Cthulhu mythos stuff in there, not just Lovecraft, but a couple of the other Cthulhu mythos authors, and also this is the last one I have to hand. This is Darker Than You Think by Jack Williamson, which I think here we go. There's a quote on the back from Horror: The 100 Best Books, the classic werewolf novel. So there's horror as well as what we might think of today as fantasy, and there's sort of science fiction as well as what we might think of today as fantasy. But if there's one thread through most of the Appendix N books, it's this idea that the characters are individuals, or at most small groups, and they're mostly concerned with their own survival or their own betterment, rather than an epic quest to save the world. That's a problem, incidentally, I think. If you cast your mind back to the 1980s, and I, along with probably many people, started role-playing in the mid-80s. I came in with a Mensa Red basic set. And got the AD&D books not long after that. So I encountered Appendix N fairly early. But most of the books in Appendix N weren't available. You couldn't go down to W.H. Smith or local bookshop and see any of them. They were long out of print. But the books that were available for the most part were epic fantasy. Tolkien, Thomas Covenant, which is Stephen Donaldson. Other people were into things like Shannara, Terry Brooks, I never was. Belgaria, David Eddings, again, I never was. But they're all big epic fantasy, not the sort of sword and sorcery that you get in Appendix N. And in terms of television influences and film influences maybe, you get things like the Conan films around about that time. Television, Robin of Sherwood on TV was a big influence on my D&D. And so I suppose, therefore, that for my generation, the fantasy influences that we're going on, obviously considerably younger than Gary Gygax, are epic fantasy influences and not a heroic sword and sorcery Appendix N type stuff. And so Dungeons & Dragons isn't really made for epic high fantasy, arguably. I think it doesn't work quite so well at high level characters. Lord of the Rings, if you think about it, your Fellowship of the Ring seems to be a very mixed level party. If you had 9 players playing the Fellowship of the Ring, then the guy who plays, no doubt, first level Pippin or Merry or Sam or Frodo doesn't get to do really quite as much as the people who are playing Aragorn or Gandalf. But something does change with this, and it's in the mid-80s, and I want to mention it because I think its influence on the history of role-playing games is overlooked, and it's Dragonlance. Now, Dragonlance was essentially a multimedia attempt by TSR to actually bring in a high fantasy, an epic high fantasy campaign for Dungeons & Dragons. It started off, the idea was to have a series of modules for first edition AD&D based around each of the types of dragons. Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, the series creators, sort of moved on quite a bit from that to create this huge epic, which would be told partly through AD&D adventures and partly through novels, which TSR and another mainstream publisher, was it Penguin, published. And it was fantastically successful. And the novels were bestsellers. The modules, despite not necessarily getting critically acclaimed, I remember seeing some quite negative reviews at the time in things like White Dwarf magazine that said, they're very too linear, they're too railroaded, people won't like playing high level characters when you have to get to high levels and so on. But maybe those were people who were old school role players who came from an Appendix N kind of background. For me, not that I played Dragonlance at the time, but for me, it was a sign actually you could use Dungeons and Dragons to play an epic fantasy campaign. I didn't run Dragonlance, but I ran my own epic fantasy campaign, and seeing Dragonlance existence was, it was not just that it said that it could be done, it was that it was a sort of a message from the people who were in charge of the game saying, yes, it's okay to do epic high fantasy in Dungeons and Dragons. I think previously the attitude in magazine articles and letters in the backs of magazines and so on was very much that, if you play high level and that's power gaming, that's not really very good, and it should be about low level stuff, and this sort of basically going off and going on a quest to defeat the evil Dark Lord is such a cliche and a bit naff. That's what I wanted to do, though. So the fact that Dragonlance came along and was endorsed and backed by TSR, I suspect a lot of people watching this video will completely disagree with me, but for me at the time, that was a really good point. And I think it's been influential in role-playing games, particularly Dungeons and Dragons. You look how D&D adventures have evolved over the years. You look at the sort of adventures that Wizards of the Coast puts out now for 5th edition. A lot of them are actually epic high fantasy. Characters in 5th edition go up much quicker in level, rather like the way the characters in the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings do. And in sort of the published 5th edition adventures, you're saving the world from dragons or demons or devils or princes of elemental evil or giants or whatever, and it is a saving the world kind of plot, which you don't tend to get with the typical 1st edition scenarios. Maybe the GDQ ones are a bit of an exception to that, but for the most part, that's not what 1st edition modules are about. So I think Dragonlance, in going away from that Appendix N feel, is hugely important. Okay, I think that's enough on Appendix N. We've got a lot of all those books I showed you are in stock, so please check out our Appendix N department. If you go to the website and scroll to the bottom for the novels section, and one of the subcategories in there, Appendix N. Next time on A History of Role-Playing Game in 101 Objects, we'll be looking at a new genre which we haven't looked at before, superhero role-playing games. Until then,